I became interested in Ludwig Wittgenstein, and especially in his masterpiece, the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, after playing a visual novel that references it extensively, called Subarashiki Hibi Furin Zoku Sonzai. And so I've been researching it off and on over the past year and a half or so. In this video, I want to do my best to make this endlessly fascinating, rich, and mysterious work accessible to others. I do not plan to do a full biography of Wittgenstein in this video, but in all ways he was a fascinating individual and truly singular mind. For a thorough look at Wittgenstein's life story, I highly recommend the biography Ludwig Wittgenstein, The Duty of Genius by Ray Monk. However, in many ways Wittgenstein's idiosyncratic and unusual personality and worldview have deeply influenced how we should read and understand his philosophy and his manner of expressing ideas, so it is worth mentioning in some ways. Wittgenstein mostly read literature, poetry, and scientific or mathematical works, not philosophy. This gives his work a strange mix of both clinical scientific taciturnity and poetic richness. It also makes his work, as difficult to grasp as it is, somewhat easy to set the historical foundations of. This is because the philosophers he directly addresses are few in number, and therefore he doesn't assume we've all read our Plato or Aristotle, for example. He was born in Austria and moved to England to study aeronautics, but became interested in the theoretical and philosophical foundations of mathematics. He was here introduced to the two figures who are engaged with thoroughly throughout the Tractatus, namely Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell. I will thoroughly introduce the philosophical insights of these two figures when they are introduced in the Tractatus proper, but some word about their place in the philosophical tradition is required. Gottlob Frege was a German mathematics professor whose role in philosophical history is of tremendous importance, but in some ways has been forgotten until interest in Wittgenstein caused a renewal of interest in his influence Frege along with him. Frege's chief accomplishment was in introducing the first system of propositional logical calculus to the Western philosophical tradition. Anyone who has taken a logic class has a long tradition going back to Frege to thank for it, even if Frege's notational system was never widely used, since it is cumbersome and awkward. Instead, I'll illustrate it with the notation that Wittgenstein uses. For an illustration of propositional logical calculus, we'll use three basic facts that we want to analyze the truth and falsity of. These will be P, the store is open today, Q, Mary is going to the store today, and R, John is going to the store today. So if we want to write either John or Mary, or both, are going to the store today, we would write Q or R. This V-like symbol means or. If we want to express that John is going to the store today, but Mary isn't, we would write R and not Q in this notation. Wittgenstein uses a period to signify and, that this is true and also this is true. In modern logic, we almost always use an ampersand, but Wittgenstein uses the period so extensively that I'll stick with this for my notation. And the tilde before Q simply means negation, that it is not the case that Q, Mary, is going to the store today. And lastly, if we want to write, the store is open today, and either John or Mary is going, we would write it as P and Q or R. We use parentheses around Q or R to make it clear where our symbols should be distributed, just like in mathematics. It is the invention of a sort of propositional logical notation similar to this that Frege is most remembered for today. However, he also had positions about the metaphysics of mathematics and logic of his own. These would be responded to by Wittgenstein, but they had their most thorough investigation and critique first and foremost by the most influential thinker in Wittgenstein's life, Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was not only a profound influence on Wittgenstein's thought, but the two actually became close friends for an extended period, before growing distant sometime around the mid to late 1920s. Unlike Wittgenstein and Frege, Russell was in many ways as engaged in social criticism, political activism, and other such humanitarian pursuits as he was philosophy, and had a disposition to jumping around disciplines and philosophical activities. His skeptical arguments against theism and liberal social positions made him most known to ordinary members of society, and in many ways he was an early public intellectual, in the same manner as someone like Noam Chomsky or Slavoj Žižek would be today. However, Wittgenstein had no interest in these aspects of his work, and in fact thought very negatively of them in many ways. The thoughts of Russell that will be addressed in the Tractatus are primarily related to the ontology of facts in logic, the representational role of language, and the role of axioms in logic and mathematics. Though the two most important thinkers for Wittgenstein are undoubtedly Frege and Russell, he did have other philosophical thinkers who were of importance to him. For example, we know that he read Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation at a young age at the recommendation of his older sister, and never shed its influence. Baruch Spinoza is another thinker who is alluded to in subtle ways in the Tractatus. The Tractatus's title is in fact an homage to Spinoza's Tractatus Politico-Philosophicus, and the Tractatus seems to have been inspired by Spinoza's ethics and its austere arrangement of its thought into fundamental axioms with implicit argumentation, though Wittgenstein takes this to stylistic extremes not seen in Spinoza. Wittgenstein was always overwhelmed with a drive toward finding truth and perfecting his thought, and was a highly systematic thinker, but also seems to have went through many profound changes in his philosophical views. He seemed to possess a near obsessive level of perfectionism toward his thought. This we can see in how few of his works actually managed to be completed. In Wittgenstein's life, he only published one complete philosophical work, the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. That said, his manuscripts and notebooks are extensive and have more than made up for this. His other most famous work is called the Philosophical Investigations, which he arranged to have published shortly after his death in 1951. It is substantive and driven enough that it is common to consider the Tractatus and Investigations as the two legitimate philosophical masterpieces of Wittgenstein, but the Investigations is, for all intents and purposes, technically unfinished. The two works seem to present very different philosophies, or at least to address philosophical problems in fundamentally different ways and from different angles. It has been customary to split Wittgenstein's thought into the early and late Wittgenstein, with the early represented by the Tractatus and his early notebooks, and the later by everything published afterward. However, in modern Wittgensteinian studies, it is often questioned how much is really different between these two eras. The biggest difference seems to me to only be a greater attention toward questions that are in Wittgenstein's language, situated in the quote-unquote stream of life, and thus more attuned towards things like psychology and epistemology. It is a common misconception that Wittgenstein's later philosophy abandoned his interest in logic and mathematics. This is not true. It is simply not as technical, and perhaps not written for logicians and mathematicians, so to say. With that in mind, this video is wholly about the early Wittgenstein, although near the end we'll touch again on just how much difference there really is between the two. While this is, in the end, a portrait of Wittgenstein's philosophy and not Wittgenstein the man, it is exceptionally hard to distinguish the two at times. Wittgenstein put a lot of himself into his work, and his work deeply influenced the way he lived. The only thing we should note about Wittgenstein the man is that he was an idiosyncratic, deeply sensitive, and somewhat enigmatic figure. He obviously had a very rich inner world that he had trouble translating to others and reconciling with an ever-disappointing world around him. It is always dicey to try to diagnose the mental disorders of those in the past, but I do believe that there is convincing evidence that Wittgenstein's eccentricity may have been in some degree due to one. Many have suggested he may have had a mild autism spectrum disorder or perhaps schizoid personality disorder, as well as repressed homosexuality. The details are not particularly important for us, but they do give some insight into his unique method of communication, restrained, peculiar, and uncompromising. With that in mind, his way of expressing himself will seem strange to most, both within his writing and outside of it, but at the same time, it is often only through this unique and self-contained sense of expression that Wittgenstein is able to express the most beguiling aspects of his thought. With that in mind, let's talk about exactly what the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus is. Wittgenstein began studying under Bertrand Russell in 1911, and dedicated himself with strenuous ardor to logical and mathematical conundrums in philosophy. He enlisted in the army upon the outbreak of World War I in 1914, and served in various positions all the way to the war's end in 1918. And not only did he return from the line of duty with honors for bravery, but also with one of the most unique, beguiling, and challenging philosophical works ever written. This was the work that would become known as the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, honed to perfection over 4 grueling years of war. He was quite confident that with this one work, he had solved all problems of philosophy. At this moment, it's worth examining the exact form of the Tractatus to see just how different it is from an average philosophical text. The Tractatus certainly gives credence to the idea that the most challenging works of philosophy are all written in German, and it stands alongside Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and Martin Heidegger's Being and Time as a dense work whose exact meaning is still a matter of debate to the present day. However, there's something quite different between those. Hegel's and Heidegger's tomes are over 500 pages each, while the Tractatus is only around 70. The Tractatus may be short, but it is dense, and one of the reasons for that is its highly unusual style and structure. The work contains almost no arguments, examples, or direct proofs, but rather consists of propositions that Wittgenstein assumes will be taken as self-evident and that the reasoning behind them will be implicit. One of the most common words used by writers to describe the Tractatus is oracular, in virtue of its declarative tone and enigmatic content. The Tractatus does not have the long-winded, rambling sentences of many continental philosophers like Heidegger. In fact, its compact writing style and rigorously ordered structure make it appear misleadingly direct and easy to grasp. But it is because of how much is not said in the Tractatus that it is so hard to interpret. The Tractatus' structure is dynamic, and in fact its afterlife on the internet has, I believe, given it a form that Wittgenstein himself would be highly pleased with. This is the hypertext website version, which I will link in the description. It shows us exactly how the work is structured. The Tractatus consists of 7 propositions as its overarching skeleton. These are: 1. The world is all that is the case. 2. What is the case, a fact, is the existence of states of affairs. 3. A logical picture of facts is a thought. 4. A thought is a proposition with a sense. 5. A proposition is a truth function of elementary propositions. An elementary proposition is a truth function of itself. 6. The general form of a truth function is bar p, bar xi, negation of bar xi. This is the general form of a proposition. 7. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. These 7 propositions are, in its shortest form, the Tractatus. But what do they mean? Each one, with the exception of 7, is joined by several sub-hierarchies of sub-propositions and clauses. For an example of how this looks, I will show the position of statement 4.0312. where Wittgenstein refers to something he calls his quote-unquote fundamental idea. Beginning, we have proposition 4. Proposition 4 has 5 points of clarification, 4.1 to 4.5. 4.1 to 4.5 all have sub-points of clarification, as well as proposition 4 itself. The ones that follow 4 itself are labeled as 4.0. These can be expanded to 4.01 to 4.06. 4.03 has 2 points of clarification, 4.031 and 4.032.